Sometimes it's good for us as Christians to go back to what we really believe and marvel again at the incredible horror and horrific, excruciating pain of the cross, and realise that Jesus did that for you and me. How amazing is God's love? Realising that it really happened actually asks us another question. What happened as a result of Jesus dying for us? We've seen that Jesus did it for a reason, and we've looked at that reason, which was to atone for what we've done wrong. But as we continue to think and understand what this means, what was the effect of Jesus' death? I think the first thing to realise when we continue to unpack this is that we deserve to die as the penalty of sin. Jesus' death met this need through his sacrifice for us. But the Bible's quite clear that the wages of sin are death. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. And the Bible also tells us that all have sinned and all fall short of the glory of God. Make no mistake, every single one of us has missed the mark. You might be slightly better than I am. You might have made slightly less mistakes than I have in my life. But actually, we've all missed the mark. And on that sense, every single one of us deserves to die for the things that we've done wrong and the way that we've messed up. We've spoilt that purity of what God's creation is. If that's true, the second thing to note is that we deserve to bear God's wrath against sin. Remember, we talked about Jesus on the cross taking on the whole wrath of God. God's justice meant that sin needed to be dealt with. And we rightly look back at some of the events of history with anger and say the injustice, with the movements at the moment like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. We rightly are horrified by some of the things that have happened, and we cry out for justice. And yet when we talk about God's justice, somehow we think that it doesn't count. Actually, make no mistake that people might get away with things in this life, but God will call us to account in the next. And we deserve to bear that. However, I want to introduce us to a word which is a little bit unfamiliar in our language, but again describes what's happening here. And it's the word propitiation. It literally means a sacrifice that bears God's wrath, to end and change it to favour. What we see, and we see the disciple that was with Jesus, who loved Jesus, who was one of the closest to Jesus, John, writes in his letter that this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to die in our place. This sense of Jesus' death was to turn God's wrath towards us into favour and restore us into that relationship. The next thing we need to be aware of that changed as a result of the cross was that we are separated from God because of our sin. But Jesus' death overcame our separation and brought us reconciliation. It takes two parties to be reconciled. One person might want to be reconciled to another, but unless both parties move towards each other, one party's chasing after another person who's constantly walking away. Reconciliation requires two people to move towards each other and restores relationship. And in 2 Corinthians 5, we see that we are ambassadors of reconciliation, that God's heart is for reconciliation. Jesus' death on the cross meant that where we were separated because of what we'd done wrong, we could now come back into a relationship and be restored. Jesus' death overcame that separation. But the other thing that we maybe don't like to admit is that we're actually slaves to sin. We have a sinful nature, and because we're slaves to sin, that puts us in the kingdom of Satan. Jesus' death, however, overcame our slavery by paying the price on our behalf. The picture that's used in the Bible is of slaves in the slave market, that when somebody would come along, they would pay a ransom, or they would pay a redemption price to purchase that slave back. And that's the picture, that's the meaning that we have of what Jesus was doing at the cross. In Mark 10, we read that the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom. And in 1 John 5, we read again John writing that the whole world is in the power of the evil one. Jesus' death on the cross not only reconciled us to God, but he also redeemed us from slavery and broke the power of Satan's ownership over us. As Paul writes in Colossians, he delivered us from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of the Son. Jesus' death on the cross redeemed us from living as slaves to sin and brought us into a whole new kingdom and a whole new way to live. So what did the cross achieve? Well, if we deserve to die as the penalty of sin, Jesus' death met this through his sacrifice. If we deserve to bear God's wrath against sin, Jesus' sacrifice turned God's wrath into favour. If we're separated from God because of our sin, Jesus' death overcame our separation and reconciled us to God. And if we're slaves to sin, Jesus' death redeemed us, paid the price to bring us back. The result of this is we have a new status. Jesus' death and resurrection means we're no longer slaves to sin. We no longer have to live lives that are defeated. We could live victorious lives, fulfilling lives, because Jesus' death broke the penalty of sin. And as a result, he also broke the power of sin and gave us a new authority. That has amazing implications for how we live. You know, when we look at situations and say, I could never achieve that, Jesus broke the power of sin. When we say that our circumstances will never change, Jesus broke the power of sin. When we say we're stuck in a sort of, I suppose, a recurring sin confess cycle where we do something wrong and we confess and we do it again and we go back and confess, maybe that's just me, but maybe you know what it's like to constantly feel like you blow it. Jesus' death broke the power of sin. We have a new power to live life to the full, free from the control of the enemy.